Good afternoon. This is going to be released on the day after Christmas, that is December 26th, so technically it's still in the 12 days of Christmas, so I'm wearing my It's Still Okay to Say Merry Christmas ugly sweater. And my video today will not have a very big Christmas tie-in, though. It's just going to have a small Christmas tie-in. The phrase I am considering today is the statement, "I believe that as a Christian." So here's the Christmas tie-in. I do not think we should use that sentence for the virgin birth. As I argued last year, and you can watch these videos anytime, the virgin birth is defensible on historical grounds through the Gospels. And it will depend in part on our other information about the reliability of the Gospels, but it's not something that requires a lot of strong theological premises in order to believe. There's a debate that William Lane Craig did where, asked about the virgin birth, he said, "I believe that as a Christian." And then concerning the resurrection, he contrasted that. And that I do think there's good evidence. In other words, that I gather he thinks the resurrection can be argued more on, independent historical grounds, but the virgin birth, you require some kind of special Christian premises in order to believe it. And I don't think that's true. That doesn't mean that I think that every statement in all the Gospels has equal evidence for it. Even the Gospels themselves give some things in more detail than others. But it does mean that I don't think we should say that we just believe the virgin birth as a Christian, because I don't think you have to already accept heavy theological premises in order to conclude that the virgin birth happened. So there's my Christmas tie-in. But I want to talk today about some completely different contexts that I don't usually talk about concerning scientific explanation and natural causes, and when we should say that we believe something as a Christian and what that would mean. So I think there can be a context where we would use a sentence like, "I believe that as a Christian." I still might not use that sentence because I'm concerned that it could give the impression that I'm believing it in an irrational way. And that is not true, or even an irrational way. And I don't think that's true. But the reason one would use this sentence would be if one needed theological premises which were then justified in some other way in order to draw a certain conclusion. So here's an illustration. Suppose that someone is ill and he and others pray for his recovery, and then he is healed apparently by medical means. He gets medical treatment and it seems to work and he gets better. Now, should he thank God? Let's say he's a Christian, he's been praying. Yes, I would say he should thank God. But that healing does not provide new and independent reason to believe that Christianity is true, because it just seems to have happened in a natural way. If God is working there, he's working as it were invisibly, he's working subtly. Even if he moved the mind of the doctor to think of a certain treatment, he didn't do it in some dramatic way, like the doctor has a vision, or the doctor says, "I had the craziest dream and it seemed like this voice was speaking to me, telling me." No, it's just that the doctor, through his knowledge, thinks of this idea or is open to this idea and tries it, and the person gets well. Now, the person can say metaphysically, because he is a Christian, let's say he is an evidential Christian and he's justified in believing Christianity to be true, he can say metaphysically, "I believe that every good gift comes from above, it comes from God. And I believe God can work providentially through secondary means and through the doctors, and that's what I think happened here, and that's why I'm going to give God thanks." Completely true. And in that case, he could say, "I believe as a Christian that God is responsible indirectly for my healing. And therefore, as a Christian, I thank God for this healing." That's completely legitimate. But he does not, in that case, have an additional theistic argument based upon his healing. So I think that's a good illustration of a way in which we could use the phrase, "I believe that as a Christian," that could be fit within a thoroughly evidential and even what we might call Christian rationalist approach. I think it can be really good to realize when we have an additional argument for God and when we don't, and that not every place where we're even justified in believing that God has acted is a place where we have an independent additional argument for God's action that's independent of other reason we have for believing Christianity to be true. This becomes relevant in yet another area, which is the area of intelligent design theory. Now, some of you may not know that I'm very pro intelligent design. I think that a lot of those arguments, as made by people like Michael Behe, actually work. I think irreducible complexity is a great concept. I haven't kept up with all of the latest ID arguments, but I think that the evidence just appears to be overwhelming for intelligent design, and that there are all these things that natural processes are not giving a good account for, and intelligent design with a real purpose. I want to bring this about, and that you can have real teleology and really bring different parts together to accomplish a particular function is a much better explanation. So there you go. I'm really in favor of this. In that case, I don't think we have to say we believe it as a Christian. I think those are actually good arguments based upon scientific data that someone has been designing things here. Now, in theory, it could be super intelligent agents, but I think the only really good candidate is, in fact, God. So that's not something you just believe as a Christian. Now, here's an interesting point. A place where I disagree with Dr. Behe and some others in the intelligent design movement concerns intervention. I think they should just go ahead and say that this is evidence for intervention by the designer. It's a little bit like this. Suppose that on Christmas Eve, a 747 appeared on my lawn, and it was there when I got up in the morning on Christmas Day, and it wasn't there when I went to bed at night on Christmas Eve. I think that would be evidence that someone was intervening to put this extremely complex machine on my lawn on that particular night. We could develop a elaborate theory that a scientist created robots 50 years ago that would come to this location and assemble that 747, and he could already be dead for all the more that he had to do, and that he set this all in motion long ago, and it just happened then later. But that's not the way to bet. That's just an ad hoc theory that one would be developing for some reason, because you didn't want to think that someone intelligent was actually coming to your lawn on Christmas Eve and causing the 747 to appear there on your lawn on Christmas Eve. Why would you think that? So the very argument from the nature of the 747 to the involvement of an intelligent agent is, by that same token, an argument for the involvement of an intelligent agent at that time. It's whether you want it to be an argument for intervention or not, it is an argument for intervention. And I think that's the case concerning intelligent design arguments. These things are coming into existence at some time in the history of the universe. They weren't there before. And we've got a design argument that design is a better explanation for them, and that natural processes are not a good explanation and design is a better explanation. On the face of it, that's a much better argument that the designer, whoever he was involved at that time, than that he set things in motion for it at the Big Bang somehow. We have no independent reason to think that, oh yeah, there are the initial conditions that brought the blood clotting cascade into existence, and we can find them separately in the Big Bang. We can't. Even the fine-tuning argument doesn't claim to find specific initial conditions for the blood clotting cascade, or even the full explanation for the development of bodies and so forth. The conditions in the fine-tuning argument, even assuming that it works, are for necessary conditions for life to come into existence, not sufficient conditions. So there's really no reason to push it back that way. You're just doing it, if you do it, to try to not talk about intervention. And so I think actually if you've got a good argument, you also have a good argument automatically for intervention. Now, there are some people who want to try to sort of split the difference here, perhaps recognizing what I've just said about intervention and also not wanting to be associated with biological design arguments. they will claim that they agree with the sufficiency of evolutionary processes for bringing all these things into existence. But then they'll just wave their hands and say, but God was necessary for the whole evolutionary process somehow. So this is a little ambiguous. Is the claim that you then have an argument for God from the process as a whole or not? Because I think what we need to recognize here is that if the natural processes are sufficient, then after a certain point, the natural processes from there on are sufficient, then you don't have any additional argument for God's involvement from the evolution of life, complex life forms here on Earth, any more than the man who was healed by medical science has an additional argument for the existence of God from his healing. He may argue further back that God had to create the human body and so forth, but that would be true even if he died of his disease, right? I mean, that's not really an explanation of his particular healing. So if you're arguing for the involvement of God over here at some earlier point, and then starting here later on, you've got some natural process that's just taking over and producing an effect over here, then that effect is no additional argument for the involvement of God. If you had or thought you had some argument for God from, the existence of the Big Bang or fine-tuning or something like that, that's just going to stand or fall completely independently of this particular outcome, such as the evolution of life. And so if you want the evolution of life or the development of life or the occurrence of, say, the blood clotting cascade or complex living organisms to have any evidential value at all in itself, then you're going to need to get down into the nitty-gritty and not just acknowledge that it looks like, from a certain point on, it was just the result of evolutionary processes, and that's a really good argument. If you think that's a really good explanation, then if you believe that was nonetheless God's doing, working invisibly through secondary processes, you can believe that. But in that case, you're believing it as a Christian, and you're not actually adducing any additional evidence for the existence of God. Theistic evolutionists are probably fine with that, but I think that phrases like, well, God is somehow responsible for the evolutionary process as a whole, are ambiguous on that point. So they could make it sound like you're saying there is an evidential argument here, but at the same time, when you get down to the nitty-gritty, you want to just say it looks like it happened by natural processes, maybe because you think it really does look that way. So I think if we want to say that there is an argument in terms of complex life forms, we should not just vaguely gesture to God's being somehow responsible for the whole process, but we should get down into the details the way that, in fact, the intelligent design theorists have, and argue that design is a better explanation than natural causes. In that case, you're not going to just have to say you believe it as a Christian. You are going to have an additional, if it works, if you get a good argument, you are going to have an additional argument. And whether you want it or not, you're going to have an argument for intervention, which might even have been a miracle. And I think that's actually probably the case. And that's why I often call myself a progressive creationist, because it looks like God was involved on multiple occasions, bringing these things into existence that would not otherwise have come to be in existence. I hope this is of interest to you, and I think this can show how we can say things as Christians that are rationally based, but we should be very, very self-aware that in that case we have no additional evidential argument. And on the other hand, if we think there is a good evidential argument, we should probably be willing to say, yeah, it looks like God actually did intervene there. And here's why I think that. And just go ahead and be bold and be willing to say that. Once again, I wish you a Merry Christmas for the remainder of the 12 days of Christmas. Come back next week, and I think we'll have another reading by esteemed husband Tim McGrew, because he's recorded some more of those for me. Thanks very much for watching.